If early reports are to be believed, intercontinental ballistic missiles have been used in combat for the first time in human history. The reports coming out actually of Kiev, Zelensky himself is claiming that an ICBM has been used from Russia into Ukraine carrying conventional warheads, which is an important distinction to make. But it's also very, very clear that these missiles that were allegedly used, and there is some interesting video to corroborate part of this, is that it could be exchanged for a nuclear payload if the Russians chose to do so. And to help try to make sense of what the meaning of this might be and where this war could be going, especially as we're now less than 2 months out from a new administration, we have back to the channel Professor John Mearsheimer, Professor of International Relations and a Professor of Political Science, rather, at University of Chicago, and International Relations theorist. John, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here, Danny.
Well, listen, I'm really glad I got you back on the show today because, man, a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing and what people are saying and positions of high power and authority is really puzzling to me. And we've been on a lot. We talk about disinformation and people saying things that are disconnected from reality. But I don't know. It seems like we're going into new territory here with some of the things that I'll be showing you today. But let's just get your initial comments here and your observation on what might be the intention of Russia using, whether it was an ICBM or an intermediate range, IRBM missile, almost doesn't matter because it is a nuclear capable missile used on Ukraine for the first time in the war. What is the significance of that?
I think the Russians are sending a signal here. You want to remember on almost the same day that President Biden announced that he would allow the Ukrainians to fire ATACMS into Mother Russia, the Russians formally announced that they had a new nuclear doctrine. Now, we knew what the broad outlines of that new nuclear doctrine were a few months ago, but it's no accident, in my opinion, that immediately after Joe Biden said that Ukraine could use ATACMS, that the Russians formally adopted that new nuclear doctrine, which, by the way, lowered the threshold for using Russian nuclear weapons. And I think this is another signal to the West that you're playing with fire. By using a ballistic missile, whether it's intercontinental or intermediate range ballistic missile, doesn't matter much. The fact is it's a missile that can carry nuclear warheads as well as conventional warheads. And the Ukrainians, of course, the Russians, of course, have not used such a weapon up to this point. The fact that they're using it now is a way of sending a signal to the West that you better not get too audacious in what you are willing to allow the Ukrainians to do, because there may be catastrophic consequences.
And what do you say to people like a retired General Jack Keane, who went on Fox News a couple of days ago and literally just dismissed this whole idea about nuclear escalation? He said, do you really think that Vladimir Putin is going to use a nuclear weapon when Trump is just 2 months away from coming in? Directly saying, don't worry about nuclear escalation. What do you say to that?
Well, he has no idea how Putin thinks about the use of nuclear weapons. He can't get inside Putin's head. And he also can't predict the circumstances that Putin is going to face over the next 2 months. I personally believe it's highly unlikely that Putin will use nuclear weapons. It's not because he would never use nuclear weapons in a situation that he viewed as dire for Russia. I think he would use nuclear weapons. But the fact is that Putin is in the driver's seat on the battlefield at this point in time. The Russians are doing very well. And the use of these ATACMS doesn't threaten Russia and Russia's fortunes on the battlefield in any meaningful way. So I don't think he's going to use nuclear weapons, period. But you want to be aware that that possibility is always there. And people like Jack Keane and others who dismiss that possibility are, in my opinion, making remarkably foolish comments, because we live in a nuclear world and one can never be certain that these weapons won't be used. And we want to act on that understanding, not on this argument that Putin would simply never use nuclear weapons.
I was speaking recently with a certain member of the U.S. diplomatic corps who claims that he has some Russian contacts that he has been unofficially talking with of late. And apparently, what's being reported is that there is growing discomfort and anger even in the Kremlin, at the Politburo, against Putin for not being more forceful in his retaliation with the West, and is putting more pressure on him to do more strong on the battlefield and possibly even use some of these missiles against targets at a higher level inside of Ukraine. And if any of these Storm Shadow missiles or ATACMS actually hit something of value in Russia, which they haven't so far, they've been fired, but they've either been knocked down or knocked away by electronic warfare methods. If there's something like the Russians are killed and something important is hit, then they may use conventional weapons at first against targets even outside of Ukraine. To what degree do you give credence to those threats?
Well, look, there's no question that Putin for a long time has been criticized inside the Russian national security establishment for not being tough enough, for not waging this war vigorously enough. So this is not a new story. And Putin himself is self-critical for having trusted the West for so long. I believe that Putin thought that he could work out a deal in the wake of the Minsk Accords. I think that he thought he could work out a deal to end the war shortly after it started. He delayed a long time before mobilizing the Russian army to fight this war. He is self-critical of his behavior before the war and in the early stages of the war. And since he made some tough decisions like mobilizing 300,000 troops in September of 2022, he still continues to be criticized for not waging the war vigorously enough. So this is not a new story. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not at some point that pressure on him to up the ante, to escalate, is going to have an effect, and he's going to escalate in a significant way. I think there is no question that given the ATACMS decision and the fact that the British are also firing missiles into Mother Russia, that he's going to have to retaliate. How significant that retaliation is another matter. Because as you well know, Danny, the Russians are in the driver's seat. They're doing very well on the battlefield. And there's no real incentive, given the course of the war, for the Russians to change their behavior in a significant way, especially with the Trump administration coming in 2 months. So I don't think at this point that Putin is going to significantly up the ante. I think, however, if Trump comes in and Trump plays hardball or tries to play hardball with Putin, that at that point in time, I wouldn't be surprised if he did up the ante significantly.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see how that's going to work out, because Trump has recently said that he is emphatically trying to de-escalate and wants an immediate ceasefire, et cetera. We'll, of course, see how that works out when he actually takes power on January the 20th. But and one of the targets of many, at least on the Russian media side, especially some of their Telegram channels, military channels, is that there's a lot of anger that they actually say, hey, Russia, Putin should go after Zelensky because he keeps making comments like this one.
Сьогодні була нова російська ракета. Всі характеристики, швидкість, висота міжконтинентальної балістичної. Зараз тривають експертизи. Очевидно, що Путін використовує Україну як полігон. Очевидно, що Путін боїться, коли поруч з ним просто є нормальне життя, коли люди просто мають гідність, коли країна просто хоче бути і має право бути незалежною. Путін робить все, що завгодно, тільки б не дати сусіду вирватись з його рук.
I'm not sure if you could read the small words on the text there, and for any of the others on a phone, you may not have. Basically, what he's saying is Russia's afraid of this. And actually, before that clip started, earlier in that same interview, which is earlier today, he said that Russia is desperate, and that's why they're going to help from Ukraine. To Iran, for North Korea, and now then they're escalating into this ICBMs, according to him, et cetera. And he goes, and the only thing is they just hate freedom and they hate us. There's no reason for them to be taking any action here. And a lot of people on the Russian side are saying, yeah, there is a reason, but he keeps making these comments. And I'm just curious as to your thought. At this time, now nearly 3 years into the war, do you think those kinds of statements actually have any influence on Western people?
No, I think that everybody or almost everybody who studies this war knows the Russians are not desperate, that the Russians are doing very well on the battlefield. I would note that there was an article in BBC the other day on the BBC website that said that there was a serious danger that the Ukrainian military would collapse. You want to think about that. BBC, mainstream Western media, is acknowledging the fact that there is a serious possibility. We're not saying it's likely. BBC was not saying it's likely, but they were saying there's a serious possibility that the Ukrainian military will collapse. That's a stunning statement. And that tells you that the Russians are not desperate, that the Russians are actually in a very good situation. There's no reason to think that the Russians are desperate. And this, by the way, is why I think that Putin is not going to rise to the bait from the West to escalate in some meaningful way, or to rise to the bait from Zelensky to escalate in some meaningful way. If he's smart, he'll just continue to wage the war pretty much the way he has been, and do everything he can to defeat the Ukrainians as quickly as possible and with as few casualties as possible.
Well, now let me ask you a question here, because there's a potential risk to that course of action if that's what Putin is doing, because it gives the impression that because of that really strong statement he made back in September about what would happen if if long-range weapons are used by the West, that they would take appropriate countermeasures, et cetera. And there's plenty of people in the West on the major media networks that keep saying it's just a bluff. He's never going to do it. And if now then weapons have been used and there is no reaction at all, that the West will continue to say, see, I told you, we can literally do whatever we want. And they'll continue to take action like that, which could be antithetical to Russia's interests. How does Putin navigate that challenge?
Well, there's no question that he has to send a signal to the West that what Biden has decided to do is unacceptable, because Putin did draw a red line. But the question is, what should the Russians do? And what they have done so far is they have formally adopted a new nuclear doctrine that allows for a lower threshold for nuclear use. And furthermore, they've now fired this ballistic missile. And I would imagine the Russians will do a handful of other things. For example, they could supply the Houthis and Hezbollah with all sorts of new weapons and give them a more formidable array of weapons to target the Israelis and the Americans with. There are a number of things that they can do. But my point is, I think the Russians would be foolish to overreact at this point in time. It's not necessary. Make it clear that they have responded, but don't change their behavior in any major way, because it's not necessary. As you know, Danny, I mean, we haven't talked about this. These ATACMS are not going to have any effect on what happens on the battlefield. The only reason that Putin really has to do something in response is because he did draw a red line and he has to send a deterrent message to the West. But in terms of effects on the battlefield, this hardly matters at all.
Right.
ATACMS are, what do they have? 50 ATACMS. They've already used 6 of them, so they have 44 ATACMS left. What are they going to do with 44 ATACMS? By almost all accounts, the Russians have launched somewhere on the order of 6,000 ballistic missiles in campaign over this war. As we all know, the Ukrainians are still fighting. Those 6,000 ballistic missiles didn't knock them out. What are 50 ATACMS going to do?
And that's assuming they actually get through, which apparently most of them have not, but I guess that's a separate issue. I want to zero in on something else that Zelensky brought up in his interview or his statement this morning, where he was mentioning the actions and the associations with Russia, North Korea, Iran, and recent reports are showing that actually China is helping in indirect ways for the Russian military, despite what has been claimed here. And at a press conference, I think it was the Secretary of State spokeswoman, Sabrina Singh, was asked, "Hey, aren't we already in World War III?"
Given the joint U.S. NATO escalation of attacks with Ukraine against Russia, and with China and North Korea joining Russia to form an alliance against the West, would not you say that World War III has begun?
I would not say that. That is not the characterization that this building assesses. And you've seen us take measures to de-escalate tensions and to and I'm sorry, I'm just speaking like broadly around the world, but when it comes to Ukraine, the commitment of this administration from the very beginning of this war was to help Ukraine take back its sovereign territory. A decision by another country to invade its sovereign neighbor cannot go unchecked. And that's why you've seen not just the United States, but 50 or so countries all around the world come together and support Ukraine through the Ukraine Defense Contact Group.
I said State Department. I meant the Pentagon, of course. That's our deputy press secretary. A couple of things from there. First of all, I found it very curious, especially in light of what she said at the last part about 50 nations coming together. She says, you know what? We've been taking a lot of measures to de-escalate. And I'm just wondering which of those measures about allowing long-range missiles or new landmines to be used into the theater of operations do you consider de-escalatory?
None of them. I mean, there's no evidence, if you look at the facts, that support her claim that we're trying to de-escalate in Ukraine. We refuse to basically negotiate with Putin. We're not interested in de-escalating. We continue to talk about bringing Ukraine into NATO, restoring the lost territory to Ukraine. I mean, I don't know what she's talking about.
And it's let's look at the genesis of the question, because he's saying, look, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and then according to Singh's own comments, 50 nations supporting Ukraine. I mean, this has the look of at least on the ground in Ukraine, it is a proxy war and direct war by those engagements, but it has the possibility of spilling over. How concerned are you that it could escalate into a broader war?
Well, I mean, it's very important to emphasize that what's happened here is that as a result of the Biden administration's foolish policies, we have clearly driven the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese close together. They now form a quite tight-knit bloc. And when you talk about the Americans, for example, getting into a fight with Iran, the Russians are in all likelihood going to be there in some form. It's quite clear that the Russians are providing the Iranians with defensive technologies and so forth and so on. So you see a link there. You see very close relations developing between North Korea and Russia. And in fact, there's all this talk about North Korean forces being in Russia and engaging in combat. The Russians and the Chinese have long been pushed together by our behavior in Ukraine. So you do have this tight-knit bloc. And one can hypothesize different scenarios where the Russians get pulled into a war involving Iran, for example. Or if a war were to break out between North Korea and South Korea, one can imagine both the Chinese and the Russians coming in on the side of North Korea and the Americans coming in on the side of South Korea. So anytime you have a tightly wound alliance or a tightly wound block of states like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, the possibility for escalation outside one theater into another theater is always present, and we have to be very careful. I do believe, though, Danny, having said all that, that it's not likely that we're going to have anything approximating a world war in the near future. And I certainly hope I'm right on that count, Fry.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope you're right on that as well. And so do all the regular citizens of the entire globe. I wanted to. I mentioned a minute ago that Russia has made some pretty strong declarations about what they're going to do after the missiles were authorized Sergei Lavrov was in a meeting where he directly commented on what Russia's actions could be.
Long-range missiles are going to be applied from Ukraine into Russian territory. It will also mean that they are operated by American experts, military experts. And we will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we'll react accordingly.
And I think that probably, I guess, speaks to your comment there that they're not going to be rash, that they are going to be calculated and intelligent and not wanting to ramp things up and taking necessary actions that would naturally escalate the war to their disadvantage, because they are winning on the battlefield unequivocally. So I suppose that you would read that part anyway as confirming what you suggested already.
Yeah. I mean, you know, Danny, you and I have long argued that the principal cause of this war is that Russia views Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat. And it's very important to underline that word existential. From the Russian point of view, what's going on in Ukraine is of enormous strategic importance to them. They view their security, their survival as under threat. Now, the problem is that most people in the West, most people in the foreign policy establishment refuse to accept the argument that Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat to Russia. They instead believe that Putin is just a good old-fashioned aggressor. He wants to gobble up some territory. And if we can stop him and even push him back a bit, we can get him to the negotiating table. We can cut a deal. And that can be a temporary deal that we can rectify in 20 years when the Ukrainians are strong enough to take back the territory they've lost. But these people in the West, and they are the overwhelming majority, do not see Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat to Russia. They don't think Russia is operating as if they're facing an existential threat. And that's why people like Jack Keane don't think that Putin would use nuclear weapons. That is why they don't understand that using ATACMS is crossing a red line. And this really matters to the Russians. This is the nightmare scenario that they feared once Ukraine became a member of NATO. It was the whole idea that the Americans would be in a position to put missiles in Ukraine, and those missiles could hit Mother Russia. Well, that's exactly what's happening now. And again, from the Russian point of view, this is an existential threat. And what people in the West think about whether or not it is an existential threat is largely irrelevant. All that matters is what the Russians think.
Right.
The Russians, over time, this goes back to the famous Bill Burns memo, have made it manifestly clear that what is going on is an existential threat. So we are playing with fire here. But the only reason for a bit of optimism at this point in time, given the fact we're playing with fire, there is a bit of reason for optimism. And that is that these ATACMS just don't matter very much. And they're not going to slow the Russians down in any meaningful way. So therefore, the incentives for the Russians to escalate in a really serious way at this point in time does not appear to be there. But then again, this brings us back to the earlier discussion that you prompted, which is that there's a lot of pressure on Putin to get tough. People think he's been a softie. So you then begin to think maybe Putin at some point will be forced to escalate in a serious way just to deal with his domestic critics. Again, the bottom line here is we are playing with fire.
Right. And I think that it's also instructive that we are oblivious to the fact that the Russians are winning on the battlefield tactically and operationally. And you talk about some possible, in a sort of weird sort of way, optimism that maybe this war could come to a conclusion before we actually cross into those red lines. And then the other danger is, like I said, if future waves of either Storm Shadows or ATACMS missiles, if they get through and hit something hard, that'll put even more pressure on Putin there. But it's one other thing I want to talk about, since we brought up Lavrov here. One of the things that might be wise for the West is to maybe talk to Russia a little bit so that you have some idea why they view this as an existential threat, and to see if there's any room for accommodation where the mutual interest of both sides could be discovered in some way and put into effect. But this is what Keir Starmer said a couple of days ago on his views of talking with Lavrov.
Have you spoken to Lavrov? President Putin's spokesperson has said the missile decision was adding fuel to the fire. Trump allies say the Biden missile decision could trigger World War III. How do you respond to that?
I haven't spoken to Russia, and I've got no plans to do so.
And I just got to ask you on that one point. There's more he has to say there. We'll hit in just a second. But upon what basis do you have to say, I want to engage the world and I'm not going to engage the people that we're against? What kind of sense does that make?
None. It's remarkably foolish. Starmer is hopeless. I mean, I'm actually quite shocked at how ignorant he is of the workings of the international system. And how foolish he is. He surely must understand that Ukraine is in desperate straits and that it's time to talk to Putin. But apparently he doesn't. So I don't know what to say. But let's switch to the Americans for a second, Danny. Look, the Biden administration is, in the process of running out the clock. There are 2 more months left. And whether or not they talk to the Russians at this point doesn't really matter very much. But the Trump administration is coming to power on January 20th. And Trump is committed to talking to the Russians. Trump wants to shut this war down. And as you and I both know, and anybody with a triple-digit IQ knows, that you can't shut this war down if you don't talk to Putin. And Trump will talk to Putin. He will try to cut a deal. So conversations will start, Keir Starmer notwithstanding, after January 20th. And we'll see where this goes.
Well, and you say that surely Starmer must understand about the tactical situation. What's going to be really important to discover is just how much Starmer changes his tune when there's a different man in the White House. So it's not just the Russian side, but it's also the UK side. Because here's what, in that same conversation, Starmer said about his view on Ukraine.
I'm at the G20 with one message, which is that we must double down on our support for Ukraine. Tomorrow is day 1,000 of the conflict. That's 1,000 days of aggression from Russia and 1,000 days of sacrifice from Ukraine. So that is my clear message here. It's number 1 on my agenda.
So how can you double down on something that has been an unambiguous tactical, operational, and strategic military failure? How can you make statements like that at this stage of the war?
Danny, I actually think there's a very simple explanation. And that is that Starmer thinks that Kamala Harris won the election. He doesn't realize that Donald Trump won the election.
Okay, there's some plausibility there. That can make some sense of it anyway.
Don't you think, Danny, it's the only possible explanation? I mean, how can he possibly be talking like this when Donald Trump won an overwhelming victory on November 5th? I mean, what planet is this guy living on? That, we're going to double down, we're going to fight to the last Ukrainian. I mean, those days are over with. First of all, look at what's happening on the battlefield, number one. BBC, last time I checked, was a British institution. And I would assume that he pays attention to what BBC says or writes. And there was a story in BBC, as I alluded to before, that said that the Ukrainians might collapse. They're in such desperate straits. And furthermore, Donald Trump is committed to ending this war. He does not want to escalate the war. It's the last thing he wants to do. And therefore, I just don't understand what Starmer is saying.
Well, there's another fact I mentioned a minute ago about Jack Keane and how he makes some of the comments here. I'm going to play a clip here of something he said on Fox News. I believe it was a day or so ago. And that the gist of it is he's going to be blaming all this escalation on North Korea and on Russia for putting these troops in there, and whether they're actually fighting is actually some dispute, because there's not a lot of evidence that they actually are, other than just being in Ukraine. But that's not the thing I want to focus on here. I want to focus on, he brings up a historical analogy here that, as an international relations theorist, I'd like your view on.
Another country has joined Russia in the fight to overthrow Ukraine. That is a major, major escalation. Providing weapons that the Ukrainians already have to be able to use inside Russia is a mild response, a limited response. Russia has escalated here dramatically, similar to Italy joining the Nazi Germany in conquering all of Europe. The Russians have run this up, and I'm astounded that the Biden administration doesn't confront them over it and blast them for what has taken place, and the Europeans as well. They're escalating it. They're making it a more dangerous situation.
So allegedly, 10,000 North Korean soldiers are in Russia somewhere, and he equates that with the entry of the nation of Italy on the German side in World War II. What say you?
Well, when Italy entered the war on Germany's side, it's not clear that that was an asset for Germany because the Italian military was so incompetent during World War II. You want to remember that Winston Churchill once said, we had the Italians on our side in World War I. It's only fair that the Germans have them on their side in World War II. So the Italians didn't add much to the German side of the equation. And I would argue here that it's hard to believe that the North Korean presence, it's hard to say exactly what that presence is and what they're doing, but I don't think the North Koreans are going to affect what happens on the battlefield in any meaningful way. So maybe there is a lot of similarity between the two cases, but who knows for sure what's going on here. The fact is, as we've said, the Russians are winning the war. And, you know, Jack Keane can say the Biden administration shouldn't tolerate this, and the Biden administration should do something to reverse events on the battlefield. I would ask him, what do you think we should do?
He said the Biden administration should blast Russia. What does he mean by that?
It's a meaningless statement, right? And as we've said on the show here today, using ATACMS is not going to affect events on the battlefield. 50 ATACMS missiles? Let's get serious. What are you going to do with 50 ATACMS missiles? This is a pinprick, right? We have no way of turning the tide on the battlefield. If we did, Biden would have used it a long time ago. So these people can huff and puff about doing X, Y, and Z, but they never tell us what X, Y, and Z is. The fact is, we got into a war that we are destined to lose. We are now desperate, and people are searching around frantically for ways to fix the situation. But I'm sad to say that there is no way to fix the situation.
Now, I want to touch on one other thing that Keane said here, not so much about Keane himself, but because this is a common thread I'm starting to see expanded along the others. And I suspect it may be laying the foundation to where to put the blame for all of this after Trump comes into office, because as you just mentioned, he's going to come in seeking to get a new negotiated settlement to end the war, et cetera. Well, Keane is saying, he was asked at this question here, what do you think this is going to, the current situation is going to mean for Trump when he comes into office here? And he's going to lay a version of the whole stab in the back deal that said, hey, if only we'd gotten more stuff sooner.
He inherits a situation that should already been over. In other words, Biden never gave the Ukrainians all the wherewithal to win this war. They gave them enough not to lose it. And you can see it every single time with the moderation, even here. You know, he's going to let them have ATACMS, but you can only use it in one part of Russia. Every time there's restrictions, limitations, or not providing them the weapons when they need it.
So, yeah, if only Biden had give the armor, the infantry personnel carriers, the HIMARS, the F-16s, long-range missiles, if only he had done that earlier, things would be different on the battlefield. Do you believe if Biden had given those things earlier, it would have changed the outcome when they actually did show up?
No. I mean, the fact is that Biden did eventually give almost all of the weapons that he initially said he would not give. He wasn't going to give them Abrams, but he did give them Abrams. And the question you want to ask yourself is what happened on the battlefield once the Ukrainians got those weapons? And the fact is, they were not magical weapons, as many people like Jack Keane thought they were going to be. The idea that giving them those weapons, even if it was delayed, giving them those weapons really mattered? No, they didn't matter. The fact is, the Russians had many more weapons. I would argue they had better weapons. And there are many more Russian soldiers than there are Ukrainian soldiers. And the end result is that Russia is going to win an ugly victory. And there was nothing we could do to avoid that. By the way, let's go back to the fall of 2022. Everybody remembers the war starts February 24th, 2022. And in the late summer, early fall of 2022, the Ukrainian military launches two major offensives, one in Kharkiv and the other in Kherson. And they do quite well. General Milley, who's then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says in the fall of 2022 that Ukraine has reached the high water mark. And now is the time to cut a deal because he says things only get worse for Ukraine moving forward. General Milley fully understood, right, that if the war went on, Russia's significant advantage in manpower and its significant advantage in firepower would mean that Ukraine would lose the war. So he was saying, now is the time to negotiate. But Jack Keane and all of those other neoconservatives disagreed. They thought we had the Russians on the rope. Now is the time to finish them off. So we encouraged the Ukrainians not to cut a deal and to fight on. The end result is that Ukraine is being devastated. It's going to lose the war. It's going to lose a huge chunk of territory, and it's going to turn out to be a dysfunctional state. And it's because all of those neoconservatives and other hawks who were unwilling to cut a deal in the fall of 2022 were wrong. General Milley was right.
And do you think that among a lot of these neoconservatives or all these war advocates, that they just don't understand how war works? Or do you think what some others seem to argue and imply is that, well, actually they do know it's not going to work, and they just don't care about how it ended up on the battlefield. As long as Russia was hurt, so they claim, and suffered a lot of battlefield losses, and there's no question that they have, that there's little concern about what it does to Ukraine, because we know that's going to be lost anyway. But net is, at the end of the day, well, at least we hurt Russia. Which of those two views do you advocate, or do you think that there's a different one?
No, I think that they honestly believe what they advocate. I don't think there's much question about that. My view is that the American foreign policy establishment is filled with people who do not have a healthy respect of the limits of military power. I'm a realist. I believe that military power matters. I spent 10 years of my life in the American military, both in the Army and in the Air Force. I went to West Point, and I understand that power and the military matter greatly in international politics. But I also learned over the course of my time in the military that there are real limits to what you can do with a military force. And if you don't understand those limits, you're going to get yourself into a whole heck of a lot of trouble. And there are just all sorts of people in our national security establishment who think that the American military can do magical things. And by the way, many of them think the same thing about Israel. They just think all Israel has to do is use more force, and that will solve the problem. And my view has long been that war is an extension of politics by other means. This is what Clausewitz taught me. Just think about those words. War is an extension of politics. That means these problems where you're using military force, for which you're using military force, are political problems. And it's very hard to solve political problems with military force. You can go a long way towards doing that in certain cases. but in many cases, it just doesn't buy you very much. There's just real limits to what you can do with military force. And again, this is a message that lots of people don't get. But what happens, Danny, is that we go out and we use military force in a foolish way in places like Afghanistan, places like Iraq, and now in Ukraine, and we lose. But then everybody has these arguments, like you just heard from Jack Keane, that explain why they were really not wrong. And if people had only listened to them, it would have turned out better. All of this is a way of saying there's no accountability in the American system. It's really quite remarkable. You have the same cast of characters war after war making the case that we can use military force to solve this problem or that problem. And if you look at how it turns out, it's never a pretty picture. But they're never held accountable. And they always have these excuses that, yes, military force was the solution, but we just didn't do it the right way, the way I said we should do it. That argument every time you can sort of skate away. And by the way, I just want to emphasize that this line of argument that I'm putting forth not only applies to the United States, as I indicated before, it applies to Israel as well. If you look at Israel's relationship with the Palestinians, and in particular Hamas, they have not defeated Hamas, despite using overwhelming military power against Hamas. They have not come close to defeating Hezbollah. They cannot defeat Iran in a war. They do not have escalation dominance over Iran. Military force is not going to solve Israel's problems. They're political problems at heart that can't simply be solved by the employment of military force. Now, I'm not arguing, of course, that Israel should not have a powerful military. I'm not arguing that there aren't occasions where Israel will want to employ its military. But the idea that it's a magical tool that can be used to solve all sorts of thorny military problems is a viewpoint that is destined to get you into a whole heck of a lot of trouble.
As we see playing out in front of our faces these days. I want to end here by playing you something that Joe Biden has said, but a little unusual in this particular clip here, because this is from 2007 when he was in the U.S. Senate. And he was talking at the time about the war that George Bush had started in Iraq and all the disasters that come from that. And at the time that this was made, there was some consideration by the Bush administration possibly carrying a strike out onto Iran. And interesting when he's looking at things from one perspective, listen how enthusiastic he is about the limits of power.
But I want to ask you about something you've been involved with. You said that if the President of the United States had launched an attack on Iran without congressional approval, that would have been an impeachable offense. Do you want to review that comment you made? Well, how do you stand on that now?
Yes, I do. I want to stand by that comment I made. The reason I made the comment was as a warning. The reason I don't say those things lightly, Chris. You've known me for a long time. I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee for 17 years, or its ranking member. I teach separation of powers and constitutional law. This is something I know. So I got together and brought a group of constitutional scholars together to write a piece that I'm going to deliver to the whole United States Senate, pointing out the president has no constitutional authority to take this nation to war against a country of 70 million people unless we're attacked or unless there is proof that we are about to be attacked. And if he does, I would move to impeach him. The House obviously has to do that, but I would lead an effort to impeach him. The reason for my doing that, I don't say it lightly. I say it because they should understand that what they were threatening, what they were saying, what was adding up to be, what looked like to the rest of the world what we're about to do, would be the most disastrous thing that could be done at this moment in our history that I can think of.
And it's just so ironic how emphatic he was about that. And yet we've already been right up to the cusp about it under his administration, with Iran having used military power to defeat incoming missiles on two separate occasions. And one wonders if there's any risk that we could be sucked into going into offensive against them. And now then here he has authorized the use of American military personnel to participate in the direct attack onto another, which could spawn a war. And nobody in Congress has been asked. And one wonders if he still stands by that comment today.
I would note, though, Danny, that in many ways, Biden has been a warmonger. I believe he's principally responsible for causing the war on February 24th, 2022. And I'm choosing my words carefully. I think he is the principal culprit for what happened there. And in terms of what is going on in Gaza with regard to the genocide, I think he's complicit in the genocide. But with regard to Iran, he has gone to great lengths to avoid getting involved in a war against Iran. This is not to deny your point that we have helped the Israelis twice now fend off an Iranian attack on Israel. But that's a different matter. What's going on with regard to Iran is that both Iran and the United States are trying to avoid getting into a war with each other. The Iranians don't want a war with us any more than we want a war with them. It's the Israelis who have been trying to bait us and the Iranians into a war. So I think one could argue that if you look at what Biden was saying in the 2007 clip that you just played, and you look at how the Biden administration has behaved with regard to getting involved in a war with Iran since October 7th, there is a great deal of consistency there.
Well, I guess we'll give him some credit on that one, but not so much on the other one here, and especially this last this issue with allowing the long range missiles. And I would like to ask you before we get off, what do you think was his motivation to wanting to authorize this after the election and just now less than 2 months before a change of administration?
Oh, I think that he allowed the Ukrainians to use the ATACMS against Mother Russia, and he gave them permission to use landmines against Russian forces for two reasons. One, he is well aware that there is a serious possibility that the Ukrainian military will collapse on his watch, and he does not want that to happen. So even though he can't help that much to turn the tide on the battlefield, every little bit might help to delay the final collapse to after January 20th so that Trump can be blamed, not Biden. That's reason number one, and I think the main reason. But the second reason is, and this gets back to Jack Keene's points, he wants to be able to say, when all is said and done, he gave the Ukrainians everything they needed. He might have given it a bit later than was ideal, but he gave them what they needed. And the Ukrainians lost, but they didn't lose because Joe Biden didn't give them what was necessary to win the war. They got what was necessary. They just were unsuccessful at fighting the Russians. So I think he's protecting himself here. I don't think it has anything to do with the North Koreans. This argument that we're out to deter the North Koreans from sending more troops, I don't buy that argument.
Yeah, there's no relation between that. They haven't fired these at North Koreans. So I don't know how that's supposed to deter North Korea when they're not even involved with that. But I think that exposes the likelihood of the two reasons you just enumerated. Well, I really appreciate you coming on today. I know you got some stuff to do to get ready for your professor job. So we appreciate you taking your time out for us today.
As always, it was my pleasure, Danny.
And certainly is our pleasure as well. And we really appreciate you guys with us today. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't. And also to remember that we are now on podcasting just about anywhere you see podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Be sure and type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will find us sitting there waiting for you. Thank you very much. And we'll see you on the next episode. Daniel Davis Deep Dive.